Hi, and welcome to Dipping in and Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I'm very fortunate this afternoon to be sitting down with Lynn Stroud. Lynn and I have been trying to get together for a while, and we've finally made it. Lynn is an activist and public speaker, and as I always like to do, I will hand over to Lynn to explain a bit more about what she does and why she does it. So, hi, Lynn.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Lucy. I
Oh,
appreciate it.
thank you.
So my journey really started many years ago. I've only been doing this advocacy work and the public speaking for the last couple of years, but really, I came from a family that had some toxicity, and I started entering into relationships in my late teens that were very abusive. There was a lot of coercive control. There was physical abuse. There was also reproductive coercion involved in those relationships and also sexual assault. But by far, the most disturbing thing I think that I've experienced was in my first marriage, um, which began, right around the age of 30. And when that marriage began to deteriorate, the experience that I had in the family court system in Texas was so disturbing that I felt like I really needed to start sharing the story so that other people could see the red flags, could see the warning signs, could, have an idea of how bad things could get so that hopefully they can save themselves from that happening, but also if it has happened to them, to know that they're not alone.
Oh, absolutely. And we've just spoken before we started to record, and we were just talking about the fact that, for a lot of people, they might think that, well, actually, this is in the US, so it's totally different. And I think we're going to find through the course of this conversation, it isn't any different. The issues that are going on in the family court systems in the US and that are going on in the UK, it's across the board. And these are failings that are going on left, right, and centre, unfortunately. And you're right, it's so important for people to realise they're not alone, because when you're within that system, and I've spoken to a lot of victims and survivors of family court, is that they do feel like they're on their own, because it is so, closed doors, everything has to be kept with, obviously, with the children and being minors, etc. It becomes very difficult, doesn't it? And I think for those individuals not being able to speak out, it's another way of them being controlled.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the abuse starts in the relationship, and then it just goes, continues on. You have the post separation abuse, and then you have the children targeted, and the children are often used as a pawn to go ahead and punish the protective parent, and then the protective parent is very often villainized in the courtroom,
Yeah.
and so it just keeps going on and on and on. Many of the people that I tried to get involved in my family court case were child protective services, which is what it's called here in the States, or at least here in Texas. That was an absolute mess of a situation. My child, when she was 4 years old, and we were in the middle of a modification, so this was post divorce, she had made an outcry of abuse to a child psychologist that we had hired to help her.
Yeah.
And the child psychologist, although they're a mandated reporter, never reported the abuse. Instead, the psychologist chose to investigate, which is not at all the
No.
route that they're allowed to take. They're just supposed to report, and then CPS is supposed to investigate. But the psychologist instead went to the alleged abuser, which was my ex husband, and essentially gave him an opportunity to come up with an excuse
Yeah.
of what happened. So by the time CPS got involved, since there were no bruises, because my child had claimed that my ex husband had thrown something at her head, there was
Yeah.
nothing. They basically just closed the case and said, there's nothing that we can do.
Yeah.
And there were other allegations as well. She also claimed that her father was calling her stupid and that he was being mean to her. So there we have a child who
Yeah.
was brave enough to talk about, verbal abuse, and still it was swept under the carpet. And it's so disappointing on so many levels because not only, did we trust this child psychologist, but we also trusted in the system, in
Yeah.
CPS, in the court system to look at the evidence when we finally went into the courtroom
Mm.
and to see this long history of coercive control against the child and using the child to abuse the mother and this and that, and still I was the one that was villainized. I was told by the judge by the time we got to trial, and the most disappointing thing, I mean, there's so many disappointing things about this, but
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
um, one of the things that surprised me was that the judge, who was in charge of my case at the time, she was female, she was a mother, and she had been a victim of domestic abuse, or so she said so when on her election platform. And so when I went into the case, I had done, a little bit of background when I found she was assigned to the case. And I was so absolutely blown away by the way that I was treated by this person who was supposedly a victim. I thought if anyone's going to get it, it's going to be this woman. But she actually told me that I wasted her time, that I wasted the court's time. And
Wow.
then she actually awarded my ex husband more time with my daughter to punish me. And she made me pay all of his attorney's fees. And we're still arguing about that to this day. And
I was just, yeah.
yeah, it's been, I think, 3 or 4 years since that trial. And
Yeah.
we're still in this mess.
Yeah, I mean, you're probably for many, many people describing their experience of the family court. And thank you so much because it is every time somebody shares what's happened to them and shares their experience, I completely understand that that is giving a part of themselves. And a lot of people might not understand that, but there'll be many people who listen that do understand that actually it is giving that you're going back through those times when you're talking about you reliving those moments, reliving those images of how the judge spoke to you, what the psychologist did. And it's huge and it's really powerful, but it also is an amazingly brave thing for you to do. And I'm very grateful for that. Thank you. Because the more we talk about it, the more we can kind of mainstream the conversation and stop putting it to one side saying, well, we can't talk about that because it doesn't affect everybody. Well, actually, it affects a lot more people than society wants to believe. And when you were just saying then about the psychologist, I'm no psychologist, but I did actually a while ago start a counselling course. And the first rule is, impartiality. You don't go, so, you have to sit there and you're their sounding board. You're not there to go and make investigations and basically give a heads up to a perpetrator so that they can get their story straight. Um, and then it's just every single step of the way, like you say, it's those systematic failings that have gone on for you. And what's awful is, all the court system should be trained to understand and see these signs. If a child of that age is saying that they're called, and we know that they're very classic signs of verbal abuse, calling you stupid, undermining your self-esteem, your self-worth, because let's be honest, it doesn't matter how old you are, we all have that effect on us if somebody says something negative to us. And if that child is coming out and saying those things, why is that not being taken seriously? And especially when the court is there to say it's in the best interest of the child. That's what I always find so fascinating is, well, if it is in the best interest of the child, then why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we going in and saying, you know what, let's just be sure, let's be safe, let's go and check this out. They don't want to. They don't want to do that. And I've seen it in so many other cases that people have come forward and spoken about. And it's devastating because that also undermines that child's experience. And so for them, it's saying, well, actually, we don't believe you. And whatever you're saying, we don't care. You don't matter. So it's reinforcing what the perpetrator has already done by calling them stupid or all the other things they say regarding verbal abuse. I think it's amazing that you're still fighting it. I think
It's
that's incredible.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's so insane to think about because really it comes down to a matter of treating people like human beings,
Yeah.
and sadly here in the US in the last couple of years we've seen the dial back of the reversal of Roe v. Wade and the dial back of so many people's rights, especially in the last several months. And it's really almost like we're living in this like dystopian nightmare. I mean, it's so disturbing watching what's happened to the United States, but it's even more disturbing watching um, what's happening to women and children, um, especially in this court system. And that's not to say that this never ever happens to men. I'm absolutely sure that there are good fathers out there who have entered the court system, and the mother has been the perpetrator. I'm sure that has happened. I think far more we see this treatment of women though when it
Mm.
comes to there's a constant disbelief. Years ago I was, like I said, I experienced reproductive coercion in a relationship. And I was very young at the time. I was only 20 years old. And when I told people about it, their reaction was so poor. It was so disappointing
Yeah.
that I was so discouraged that I never even bothered to go to the police.
Yeah.
And so you see this constantly. You know, uh, you're abused by someone. In my marriage, things took a very dark turn once my daughter was born. There was definitely red flags before that, but once my daughter was born, we had already been married for several years. We had already experienced miscarriages. And so I was already in full on grief from that. I was so grateful just to be pregnant with my daughter and that things were going well. I was so focused on her just being born healthy, that once she was born, there was this sudden shift in my ex husband's behavior. And it was really like he was jealous of her.
Yeah.
And to be honest, he was disappointed at the fact that she was a girl.
Oh, how many times I've heard this, and it's so heartbreaking, you know. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah,
And it's something I couldn't even admit to myself at first because I thought, no, that can't possibly be the case. I mean, we're talking, my daughter was born in 2016. So I was like, we're not in the dark ages here.
yeah,
I'm not required to give you a male heir, like I
yeah,
don't,
yeah, the air and the spare. Yeah,
like it's just and so I thought that it was so crazy when I came home from the doctor's office and I first told him, we're having a girl because I had gotten these genetic tests back early on in the pregnancy and his face just didn't look quite right. And I decided just to ignore it. And I
yeah.
thought, oh, maybe he just needs some time to, get this idea into his head. And then when he ended up leaving, when my daughter was around 11 months old, he said to me, um, was, I'm going to go find someone else and get the son that I deserve. And I thought,
Wow.
okay. So just to be clear, I went through years of, testing, some of it really painful.
Yeah,
I don't think enough people, and it's like you were saying, we always want people not to talk about it. Well, don't talk about the court system. Well,
yeah,
people treated when I had miscarriages the exact same way. Well, we don't talk about that type of thing. We just, get on with our lives and try again. Well, I think that's absolutely ridiculous. How are we
yeah,
supposed to process any of our grief if we're just constantly eating it, like
yeah,
just and so, I went through all of these years with my ex-husband of, fertility treatments and some of them really painful and pills and testing and all of this invasive stuff. And then on top of it, recurrent miscarriages, and the pain and the grief that that caused. And then for him to turn around and say, even though we have this healthy child, it's still not good enough. You're still not good enough.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and that's when I started to dive deeper into my research about narcissists,
yeah,
and narcissistic personality disorder and some of those dark personality traits. And, and it sort of opened up my eyes to the fact that I was being traumatized throughout the marriage and the post separation abuse was I mean, the text messages that I received from the time that he left the home to the time that the divorce was filed, which was about a year, consisted of everything of, threatening to come in the house in the middle of the night,
Mm.
um, accusing me of, having affairs with,
Another
like
classic
multiple
sign.
men, which is hilarious because like even if I had wanted to start a relationship with someone at that point, which I didn't, how would I have had the time? Like I
Yeah.
had an 11-month baby in tow. Like who is walking around,
Who's who's got the time and
right? Like
working
I
and everything? Yeah,
like
yeah,
I had a like a barely 1-year-old who was breastfed on demand, like
yeah. Yeah,
dating.
you're really gonna go dating then, aren't you? Yeah.
Exactly. I was like, yeah, let's have someone just jump right into that mess when I don't have time to shower or, like, and I had to figure out so much because, the abuse was on so many different levels. Like he was financially abusing me because he would make comments towards the entire marriage to the effect of, why don't you just stop working? I'd like to take care of you. And I had been a paralegal for many, many years. And yet he kept saying, well, why don't you don't need to work. So why don't you just stay home? And then once our child was born and, I was happy being a stay-at-home mom while she was really young. I was grateful to have that time. The comments became more like, this is my money. I made this money. You're not entitled to this money. So very quickly, I could see that it was a trap.
Yes, that
He wanted me
shift.
to stop
Yeah,
working. He wanted to take away any kind of power that I had and leave me completely helpless.
that's so. And the awful thing is, and I say this in so many episodes, is it's as if there is this handbook that all perpetrators go away and look through and tick the boxes of the isolation when it comes to finances, the way they treat the females of the family, i.e., either their partner or their daughters, or it happens in so many situations. It to me, I can't believe it's not more kind of commonplace to talk about it. And the problem is, like you were saying before, is people aren't going to talk about it if the reactions they're going to get, like you said, reactions that you got talking about reproductive coercion, were so poor. When we talk about all the statistics and everything else, it's people aren't going to speak out if they think that they're going to be judged the second they open their mouth. Because, when we look at post separation abuse, well, surely it's all done and dusted now. You're fine. You're out of that situation. Actually, no, it's a million times worse. Sometimes people have said to me previously, I would rather be back in that situation than be dealing with what I'm dealing with now in post separation when I'm trying to fight for some semblance of a life and some level of freedom from that perpetrator. That's a terrible statement to make, that you'd rather be back with, better the devil you know, because what you're experiencing through post separation abuse is awful. And I think because we don't, as a society, talk about it enough, these kind of things and these conversations, people need to learn to have that unconscious bias of. I was talking to somebody the other day and they came out with a brilliant saying, and I was asking them what would they do. That a therapist, her name's Jennifer Parker, and I was saying, what would your advice be if somebody was looking at seeking support, speaking at what would you say? She said, you have to meet them where they are. And I thought that's so powerful because where you are in your own life as a member of society isn't where somebody else is at when they've experienced abuse or are still experiencing abuse post separation. We have to remember that everybody's situations are different. And, unfortunately, this is all going on in the background while you're trying to live your life, while you're trying to enjoy spending time with your daughter. That's another aspect people don't see, isn't it? That life is marching on while all this is going on. You still want to have those moments with your child where it's fun and it's happy, and we're not thinking about all that crap, if you mind my language, that's going on in the background. You want your children to grow up and have lovely memories of their childhood. And I think that society doesn't appreciate that enough, that these parents that are fighting for their children to have some semblance of normalcy in their childhood, it's a fight that nobody would want to take on.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And it's so um it's so disheartening to see your child go through exactly what you went through,
Yeah.
because all I ever wanted for my daughter, I have two kids because I eventually remarried and had a son. So all I want for both of my children um is happiness
Yeah.
and freedom and a chance to make their own decisions. Um and a chance at a good life.
Mm.
And to have it, I think every parent almost wants their kid to have it a little better than they did.
Yes.
If there's
Oh,
any spot that they struggled in, you want your children to never have to struggle in that position. And so watching the court treat me, like I was the villain,
mm,
playing this reversal role, this Darvo game, um, and then watching a few years later, my daughter be brave enough to make an outcry of abuse against her father and watching the system cover it
okay.
up again
Yeah.
is so painful because it's something I never wanted for her. It's something I never want for any child. Um, and so, yeah, it's just been such um, it's been so many years of this because, even though I never got the court system involved or law enforcement involved years ago when I experienced the reproductive coercion, um, the damage then was mostly from peers
Yeah.
around me, the toxic people that I had in my circle at the time. And, unfortunately, most of them were friends with the abuser. They were mutual friends. So, uh, you know, but also it's I don't think that at that time, because we're talking over 20 years ago that first took place, I don't even think that we had the word reproductive coercion back then. We
No.
may have been starting to talk about coercive control, but I don't even think then. I mean, we're talking circa like 2000, 2001. I
Yeah.
don't even think those words would have escaped from anyone's lips at that time. And so I think if I had gone to the police and said something happened, with a partner of mine,
Mm.
I think their first thought, line of questioning would have been, well, did the sex start consensual? And my answer would have been, well, yes, it started that way,
Yeah.
but it certainly didn't end that way. And the
Yeah.
verbal agreement that we had as a couple, he
Mm.
violated that and he violated my trust. And I feel like I was sexually assaulted. I think they
Mm.
probably would have laughed in my face
Yeah.
and
I
been like,
agree. Yeah.
yeah, they probably would have said, well, I think that what he did was disrespectful, but good luck taking that to a court,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
And that's what a
Um,
perpetrator relies on. They rely on the fact that they'll say, prove it, prove that I did that. And that to me is, again, it's constantly coming up against these barriers for victims and survivors. And nobody is helping, nobody is saying, actually, I am going to listen to what you're saying. And we're in, I think, only now, 2025, we're only starting to scratch the surface of people actually understanding that domestic abuse and post-separation abuse isn't always necessarily the physical abuse. When we see, we talk about domestic violence, for example, people often kind of say, oh, well, I was, they didn't hit me, therefore it wasn't abuse. There's many, many other ways of abusing someone, like coercion, like the financial abuse, like the sexual abuse. Like these are all other ways of being abused. And I think it's only now we're starting to scratch that surface of people sort of starting to understand the effects and the impact that has, and their lifelong impacts, on and like you say with with your daughter. I've always thought, and luckily I did for a time when I worked for my local domestic abuse charity. I worked with children and young people, and I was very lucky to sort of shadow what was going on with the trained staff there. And what was really interesting to see was the impact that that support had on those children over a period of time, and seeing their understanding of what abuse was, as opposed to a child that's never had support, who doesn't understand that that behaviour isn't normal. And for me, it should be something mandatory across the board, regardless whether it's in primary schools, elementary schools, whatever it is. We need to be having those conversations. Yes, let's talk about healthy relationships, but actually, let's talk about abuse, Because if we look at the statistics, I always say they're never a true reflection, because exactly like we've just said, so many people don't report. There's such underreporting, and I would imagine it's exactly the same in the US as it is in the UK. There's so much underreporting because people think, well, no one's going to believe me. Look at what I'm coming up against when I'm trying to tell my story. So, there's a lot of that going on. And so really, we need to be going back to looking at children and saying, let's have this conversation. It doesn't have to be a scary conversation, it can be an age appropriate conversation. But if that helps a child sitting in the classroom think, hang on a minute, that happens in my house. When I get called stupid, but nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to go, no, 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 that doesn't happen in our school. We don't want to talk about that. That doesn't happen in our college. Actually, of course it does. Of
Mhm.
course it does. It happens across the board. But we need to start changing that mindset as to domestic abuse being this dirty subject, a taboo subject. It's not. It's not
Right.
at all.
Right. It's actually it's quite the same as teaching safe sex.
Yeah.
It goes right along the lines of teaching safe sex. It's
Yeah.
teaching safe relationships. It's
Yeah.
teaching healthy relationships, and not even just sexual relationships, but friendships as well. Because
Exactly.
if you end up in those toxic friendships, if you end up in a toxic circle, it can be just as damaging
Yeah.
as being sexually abused, as
Yeah.
being, as experiencing domestic violence.
Mm.
Because when those things happen to you, when you need the correct support, you're not going to get it.
No. No. And that's so true because, and I love the fact I'm agreeing with everything you're saying 100%. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think one thing I often think about when I think of children and working with children and having my own children is when we're seeing these children in the classroom, if out of say 30 children in a class, for example, five of them are living in a household where there is domestic abuse present, or they've lived in that situation, now it's post-separation abuse and they're out of that situation, but it's still ongoing. How many of those children are going into friendships within school where they're actually picking friends who are bullies? They're scared of those people because that's what they see at home as normal is, well, they call me stupid. So therefore, being with these friends is no different. They call me stupid as well. It's actually damaging those children in the sense of the friendships that they're picking, because that will then lead on to the relationships they pick as they get older. And that turns into the romantic relationships as well as, like you say, those toxic peer group friendships. And that's why we need to make it clear, it is unacceptable. I've often said when I've spoken to parents or I've spoken to professionals about children in particular, very often with children, there is no harm in saying to the child, you can love that parent. No one's asking you not to love them, but you don't have to respect that behavior that they're
Mhm.
displaying towards you. Because to tell a child not to love somebody, all they're going to do, children love, they're just open little books, aren't they? They're just gorgeous little hearts that want to love everyone, and they can love that person because we don't want them growing up bitter and hateful and resentful and all those things, but actually they don't have to like the behavior, they don't have to respect that behavior. And there's that fine line, I think, isn't there, with children of being able to say that and say, yes, love that person because they're your parent. However, over time, you will see that this behaviour isn't acceptable, hopefully, and then you can make your own choices. And lots of people choose to not have contact then with that parent, but it becomes their choice then. And that's what I think is so important, is that level of support that children have just isn't there at the moment. It's not there. And like you say, systems are failing them constantly by making them really seem like they're lying. Well, we can't trust them because they're only little. We can't trust what they're saying. I don't know, I'd be intrigued because in the UK, we have something called the voice of the child. So when the child turns, I think it's 12 in the UK. So when they're 12, if, for example, there's court proceedings going on, the child's voice will be heard.
Mhm.
So the sort of children's services over here would sit down and speak with the child, because obviously by that point it's considered that they're at secondary school, they've had to learn some level of independence. They're able to cognitively by this point have a conversation about whatever it is that, may be an issue. But I just wondered if you had the same in the US in terms of that voice of the child.
So here in Texas, we have something similar. I believe it's
Yeah,
also the age of 12.
yeah,
The sad part about it is that, if your child has spent so many years going back and forth, with this abuser, the abuser, let's say, the child's been going back and forth since they were 3 or 4.
yeah,
The the abuser has had so many years to mold the child, to manipulate them, to try to spoil them, to try to poison their thinking, that by the time they hit 12, you really don't know what's going to happen, regardless of what the truth is.
Yeah, true.
And then the sad part is, it's even if the child can say at the age of 12, I want to live with the protective parent, the court can still turn around and
Yeah,
say no.
yeah,
So now you have a child who was brave enough to speak out and say, I don't want to live with that person. I want to live with this person.
yeah,
And you're going to tell them again, oh, well, thank you so much for being brave and speaking up. We don't care.
yeah,
You're going to spend time with both parents because
yeah,
we think it's the right thing to do. We think it's the fair thing to do, to go ahead and split your psyche in half
yeah,
and
yeah,
make you,
yeah.
and force you to deal with both of your parents for another 6 years.
Yeah, and that's it's so frightening because then we're running the risk of children saying, well, I'm just not going to go. So the protective parent then is in a position of what I like to call catch 22, where they can't physically force a child into a car, for example, to take them to the perpetrator parent's house. And then they're breaching the order. But then you can't force them into the car, so you'd be physically abusing them yourself if you were physically forcing them into the car. You can't do that if a child is, say, 12 years of age and potentially the same height as you are, and a lot of kids these days are very grown up looking, and trying to then to navigate that when they say, well, you breached the order. Yes, but I can't get them to go. And then on the flip side, when I've seen parents who said, I'm stopping contact because something's happened, and the court will say, but you need to send them. But you've told me if there's a problem, I should stop sending. Right, well, we've decided there isn't a problem, so you have to start sending again. And then the child won't go. And it's just this vicious loop that goes on and on, like you say, until the court order no longer applies. And that's a long time in a child's life, a very long time from them being very little, more often than not, when it starts, to them then being basically an adult, 17, 18 years of age. And like you say, what is that teaching that child about how their opinion is viewed, how their self-worth is viewed? You don't matter. You're going to have to do as you're told. And I just think it's so damaging and it's so harmful. And unfortunately, I think when children, I've seen this a lot happen as well, children who've come to sessions in years gone by, and you can see when they've come back from the perpetrator parent, and I would call it like a de-escalation. So when they're back with the protective parent and people don't see this, society again don't understand it, is when a child has been for, say, I don't know, a holiday potentially with the perpetrator parent, that perpetrator's had a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is, to completely go at that child, whether it's psychologically, whether it's physically, whether it's emotionally, whatever it is. And then when that child comes back to the safe place that they know, their head is all over the place. So they may act out. They may come across as being more rude or abrupt than they normally would be, or showing, temper tantrums, or crying a lot, or feeling really anxious, or not wanting to leave the protective parent's side. There's so much damage that's going on there. And that takes time. And again, that's something that's put on the protective parent to have to constantly reassure them, know that it's going to pass, but it's going to take time.
Right, right. That's something that we currently deal with, my husband and I. My daughter at this point goes week on, week off, unless it's like a summer or a holiday or something. And every Monday that we pick her up from school, we are always bracing ourselves a little bit for, what might be going on.
Mm.
Sometimes she handles it pretty well. Sometimes she is so attached to me
Yeah,
that I can't even get her to go to, an art class, or,
mm,
she just does not want me to leave her.
yeah,
And it's really heartbreaking to witness. And it's hard for my son as well because they spent so much time together when they were younger. I don't even think that my son really truly understands that she has a different father,
yeah,
because my husband has always been the father to the both of them. My
Yeah.
husband is the one who
Yeah.
taught my daughter to tie her shoes and how to read, and helped potty train her,
Yeah.
and read books to her at night, and all those, because he's been in her life since she was around 2 years old. So,
Yeah.
um, but trying to explain to my son that his sister has to leave every other week because she has a different father, and his questions, will sometimes be, well, can I go over there too? And can I play? And how do I explain to my son that I don't feel safe
Mm.
with him going over there, but that I have to let her go
Yeah.
there? It doesn't
Yeah.
seem to make any sense that she should have to go somewhere where I don't feel safe with him going.
Yeah.
And I think that the court's response to that would be say that, well, that's a you problem, but really it's
Yeah.
not. It's not a
Yeah.
me problem. It's a her problem. It's my kid's problem,
Exactly.
because she's
Exactly.
being forced to go with someone who's unhealthy.
Mm.
um, and you're telling me that if I don't let her go, that you're going to essentially, file a breach against me, and quite possibly, fine me or put me in jail.
Yeah, exactly. And that's always the fear factor that they go for, isn't it? Like the penal notice, you'll go to prison or you'll pay a massive fine, or, just to scare you into submission. But what they don't see is these individuals have been submitting to the perpetrator for so long. It's now, no, no, you can't, do this to me anymore, and you can't do this to my child. I think as well, especially when you have, like you just said with your husband now, thank goodness, you have a lovely person in your life. I think a lot of the time, children from who've experienced abuse, whether they've experienced it personally or whether they've witnessed it in the family home, I think when they have that strong role model in terms of, say, a father figure who isn't their biological father, but is their stepfather or uncle or grandfather or whatever, whoever they may be, when a child sees how that person behaves, and then they go to the perpetrator parent and see how they behave over time, and I've seen it happen myself, is children will eventually go, hang on a minute, that behavior, no thanks. This behavior and how they react to situations and how they talk to me and how they treat me is exactly how I feel safe and comfortable and loved and appreciated. And my dad always has this fantastic saying, don't tell me, show me. And I think perpetrators are very good at telling us, and love bombing and getting what they want. But then over time, the actions don't marry up with the words. Whereas with somebody that is secure and safe, those words and actions marry up. And I think over time, children start to see that. And as much as they might still love the perpetrator parent, they know that the example they're being set is by somebody that actually genuinely cares about them. And you've made me think of, I did an episode a while ago with a lady called Sari Taylor, who's a psychotherapist. And I remember asking her once, can a child who has experience, and she specializes with children, and I said, a child that's been in an abusive situation, growing up, can they go on to move forward with their life, hopefully live a happy life and a content life? And she was saying, if they have one parent that's stable, then yes, 100%. If both parents aren't stable, it's very unlikely. But even if you have a perpetrator parent, if you have one parent that is the stability, that is the safe haven, that is the kindness, the consideration, all of that, then yes. And I remember thinking, I'm so relieved to hear that, because it makes even though the protective parent is dealing with so many horrendous situations, they know that what they're doing is for the greater good. And what they're doing is giving their child the chance to see, this is how you treat another human being. This is how you are loved. This is how you respect yourself, your body, your mind, all of it. And over time, I think, perpetrators always show their true colors. It always comes out. And sometimes it takes a very, very, very long time. And that's the problem. We see it in these films, don't we? It's all tied up in a couple of hours of somebody being the perpetrator or the horrible individual. And then it's all done. But that's not real life. This is stuff that people are dealing with year in, year out. And it's a marathon, not a sprint, isn't it?
Right. It really is. It's looking towards the long game.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really good point that you make. We've seen so much, as I mentioned, dial back in America. so much that the threat of even speaking of diversity, equity, and inclusion can now be punished. You can now lose your job, and um, things of that. You can lose your funding and things of that
Yeah.
nature. But what they cannot control, what they will never control, are the conversations that go on inside my house, are the things
Yes.
that are the parenting that I am reinforcing. So we regularly have conversations with my daughter, and she's almost 9, but she's extremely intelligent, extremely articulate, and so mature for her age. And so my husband and I have conversations with her about racism,
Yeah.
about equality, about, you know, uh, being tolerant, being a good human being, being a good friend, what
Yeah.
respect looks like,
Yeah.
all of those things. And, I am grateful that, I am in a healthy relationship now, and that hopefully she is seeing that, regardless of what she may be seeing when she goes to the other house.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a lovely way of, I don't like ending these conversations because I love them so much and I could quite happily talk all day to you. But it is, I think we need those kind of happy endings, if you like. We need those lovely stories of people who have, and not everybody wants to meet somebody else. And I always say that when, especially when I've run groups and things, some people are quite happy to say, actually, I'd rather be on my own for the rest of my life. But for those who do want to be in a relationship and find somebody that they know they can trust and they have that mutual respect, I think it's incredible. And I think so many people deserve that in their lives, that want that in their lives. And as you say, with your daughter, and with your son, they're in that lovely safe unit. And one thing, I was talking to somebody over here who's called Richard Paul. He's MBE. He's a family court solicitor, and he talks about it doesn't last forever. As hard as it is, and as horrific as it is, and nobody's taken away from the fact how long it drags on for. But there is, if anybody is listening, there is an end in sight. You just have to take care of yourself as well as your children. You have to look after your own well-being, don't you, and your own mental health and your own self-care whilst going through all of this, because you will hit burnout. Otherwise, you need to sometimes stop and say, actually, I need 5 minutes for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think you're doing marvelously. And I think the way you are getting out there and speaking about it, it's so important. And as awful as this is for me to say, I'm not glad it's the same over in the US as it is in the UK. But in some ways, these sort of situations unite us more. So we know that we're not alone. We know that it goes on across the world. And if somebody is listening from the UK or somebody's listening from the US, you're not on your own. We're all in this together,
Right.
and we won't stop.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that.
Oh, Lynn, thank you so, so much. You have been
Thank you.
incredible. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I hope lots of people get a lot out of that. So thank you.
All right. I hope so too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Where